It's funny, I hadn't watched it for a few years, and at the time it came out, I was actually on Flores, and so I was pretty perturbed. Like I was angry, right? But now when I watch it, I actually quite enjoy it.
Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Kimberly Plomp. I am a biogeologist. I study human disease and evolution.
I'm Ross Barnett, a paleogeneticist, mostly looking at Pleistocene cats.
And today we have a special guest with us.
I'm Matt Tocheri. I'm a paleoanthropologist from Lakehead University.
And when I reached out to you to be a guest on our podcast, I had a movie in mind, but you suggested a different one. So the movie you suggested for us is an Animal Planet special called The Cannibal in the Jungle.
That's correct. I like to be a pain and get you on your tips of your feet.
This is a much better movie than the one I had in mind, which maybe we'll have you on for in the future if you want to do that as well. But I think this is going to be a much better episode. Not to dissuade listeners from listening to whatever future episode we have you on as well.
Josh lost his movie choosing privileges for a little while. They've been revoked as punishment for the last movie we watched. So
with extreme prejudice.
That's good. It's good that you chose this.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad. It sounds like you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Matt, do you want to say why you suggested this movie and summarize it for us?
Sure. Well, okay. So I guess, the reason you have me as a guest is because I'm involved in the archaeological research surrounding Homo floresiensis on the Indonesian island of Flores. And so because in the early 2000s when they were discovered, the nickname the hobbits was quickly given to this extinct species of humans. And so because of that, there's lots of connections with pop culture, things like that, references to the hobbits and or movies. And when you asked me to maybe do an episode to watch one of these movies that has some sort of connection to Homo floresiensis, this one immediately came to my mind because partly I think it's relevant in the sense that, what we all face today with misinformation. Things are getting more and more sophisticated in terms of tricking us into believing what we see and hear. And it is a movie, but it was presented and it takes the shape of a documentary. So not everyone is able to discern whether or not it's real or fake. And I remember, I think I've mellowed over the years with this. When it first came out, I was definitely not happy. And I was angry, how dare they do anything like this? But now I kind of enjoy it. And I actually am now even thinking of incorporating it more into my teaching to help students realize how they can be fooled, right? And how they need to be constantly thinking critically about what they are seeing and hearing. And so, it's an interesting hour and a half.
That's a good idea. I might steal that idea for teaching my grad students.
Yeah, I was just like, it was partly this when you guys invited me to do it, and I watched it again, and I thought, you know what, I do teach every other year. I teach a fourth year advanced paleoanthropology course, and sometimes it's a for graduate students as well. And I focus it entirely on Homo floresiensis, and we read essentially all of the literature that's been published. And so I thought, wow, this might be a great way to start the course off. Have everyone watch this before they start reading the articles. And so to see how many of them fall for parts of the storyline.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, anyway, so the story that's behind this is it's loosely based off the discovery of Homo floresiensis. And they come up with a pretty interesting story about an ornithologist or two ornithologists and their Indonesian field assistant that are working on Flores in the 1970s. I think it's set in about 1977. And anyway, they the story is that only one of them walked out of the jungle, this American ornithologist, and that he was accused of killing and even cannibalizing his two colleagues. And they sort of have footage of him going to prison, and they have different officials that are sort of provide interviews in a documentary style about what was going on. And that's how he was languishing away in an Indonesian prison for 25 years or so until the discovery of Homo floresiensis. And that then sort of matched his story that he had always said, that he did not kill his colleagues, that there were these little savage people that did it. And so the documentary flows through this storyline with a combination of these details of this fictional story combined with a documentary style telling of some of the aspects of the discovery of Homo floresiensis. So I'm curious, like, what did you guys think? I mean, from what I guess, you guys hadn't seen this before, so...
I'd never even heard of it. Yeah, no. I enjoyed it. I thought it was well done. Yeah, I enjoyed watching it. It reminded me of when I watched Blair Witch when I was younger, and I wasn't sure if it was real or not real, and it terrified me.
Yeah, exactly. It did have a lot of those components to it.
Yeah.
I really liked it. I thought it was really engaging, really well done. But I can also see how it sort of walks a dangerous line because it mixes fact and fiction so much that unless you have a very good understanding of what the kind of background facts are, then you're going to be misled, and that's probably not a great thing. That's not what you want from a channel like Animal Planet, which should be a trustworthy source of information,
like Discovery Channel.
But I thought it was incredibly, well written, well kind of produced. The storyline was pretty gripping, I thought. Acting was good, and the kind of cutting back and forth between the 1977 story strand with the ornithologists and the kind of present day Hornbrook, the paleoanthropologist that's going back to exonerate essentially the guy that was put in jail for the murders back in the 70s. I thought that was extremely well done too. And it was one of those films which has been quite rare for this podcast, where I didn't actually need to speed it up or kind of flick between checking Facebook or Twitter or something like that. It kind of kept my attention all the way through. So, I can't fault it for not being a really good piece of entertainment. But I think we have to fault it for, almost trying to trick the audience into believing something which just isn't true. And like Kim was saying, the Blair Witch Project, absolutely, I got those kind of vibes from it. But what it reminded me as well of is something which is kind of, I guess, quite insular to my kind of British television upbringing. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. There's a program called Ghost Watch, which was broadcast in 1992 on Halloween. And it took a similar format. It was, put up as a kind of live broadcast on Halloween looking for ghosts, except actually it was a scripted program that had been recorded like weeks before. And they used, real trusted TV presenters to host it. They kind of gradually ramped up the weirdness until it kind of ended with, ghosts breaking out in the TV studio and bedlam erupting. And then it just sort of faded to black. And it was a real kind of big thing over here in the UK when it came out, because people just hadn't seen this sort of style of storytelling before, where you mix the kind of factual and the fiction. And there was, it kind of got banned. It was like not released on video for 10 years and after. There's people that ended up kind of self-harming because they'd been so traumatized by watching this. So that was what it kind of gave me vibes of. But yeah, I thought it was really, really good. Worryingly good.
That sounds almost like George Orwell when he broadcasted War of the Worlds and people freaked out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember, like, for me, how it was 2015 and it was early May, and I was on Flores at the time, and we were getting ready to conduct field work, or I'm trying to think back. Maybe we were already excavating, but I
Orson
know
Welles, not George Orwell. I just have to shout that out.
Oh yeah. And then
I was close.
And then I got an email from one of my colleagues, Tamara Varney, who's at Lakehead, and she was like, "Hey, do you know about this? Are you in this?" And she sent me this link, and it was a link to the trailer for it, and it was coming out, in a couple days. And I watched the trailer, and the trailer was like intense. Like you can imagine, there's a lot of reasonably well shot footage in this show, and so when they compile it into a 3 or 4 minute thing, it's like what? And so I was then just curious, and we were all talking about like, what is this? Did any of us know about it? And none of us knew. And I forget how. Somehow we were able to watch it pretty soon after it came out. I don't know if it ended up on YouTube, or maybe it was even right through Animal Planet. And so I can remember sitting there, at a table where we have, bones and artifacts laid out from the excavations at Liang Bua. And, there we are watching this. And even for the first couple minutes, like, I'm like, what is this? Is this a aspect of that, like this Timothy Darrow story? Like that, I don't know. I mean, maybe, is this real? Is this loosely based on some sort of fact? Like, and it wasn't until then, when the narrator, the archaeologist, Dr. I think it's Richard Hornbrook, comes on and it shows his name and affiliation. I'm like, well, wait a minute. This is not nobody I know. Like, this is not real. Like, and for some reason, I don't know if it's just my memory, but I could have sworn that the first time I saw it, that it used Michael Morwood's name. Maybe I'm misremembering that, or maybe it was a different cut. Like I wasn't sure.
It sounds quite possible. I mean, it's got Henry G. Gregory Forth in there, who are real people talking about the real sort of thing. But that's
really them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
that's
them.
Yeah.
And I don't know, because now I've searched around, and even on like the director's cut and everything, the Hornbrook name is there the whole time. So I'm wondering if I just have misremembered. It was I was certainly, drinking some Indonesian bintang beer when we first watched this. And so maybe I just was like, oh no, that's not Mike. I mean, this can't be, this is ridiculous. But over the years, it kind of filtered into my head. I'm not sure.
I mean, it's definitely meant to be, I think, Mike Warwood. This is kind of Australian.
Exactly. So I don't know if the first time they did it, maybe they just, the Animal Planet had put that over top instead. And now they've changed, like they probably might have gotten, legal pushback.
He might have given them a bollocking. Yeah.
Yeah. But so I'm not sure. But in any case, there was that. And, it was just it was just sort of surreal to be watching it, while actually there. And like I was, it did at the time. I was really angry and upset. Like I thought, this is the last thing, we need, because there's always stuff generally with Homo floresiensis that, gets on our nerves when it's misrepresented in any way. But over the years, I've kind of mellowed on this, because I think it like you said, Ross, it walks a dangerous line, and yet over the past 7 years since it first aired, we're just seeing more and more of this kind of thing everywhere in our daily lives, and unfortunately, this is becoming the norm. And again, when they first presented it, they made no attempt to say this is a made-up movie. This was a documentary about what has happened on Flores, and there was no indication whatsoever, unless you could pick up details, to know. And you can even see that to this day, on the comments on the various YouTube channels where they've got this up. People just don't know. Like, they're like looking for answers. Is this real? And not everyone is savvy enough to even know where to look to figure that out. And it's not until the very end that there's this little disclaimer, that comes up at the very end of the film after the credits. I mean, how many people are watching to that point and then are going to squint at their screen to read that it's all fiction? And so, at the time it was hard. You couldn't just Google it and find out. There was no information up there. Whereas now you do, and you'll see the people mentioning how it's it's a movie, not a real documentary.
But if you were to Google at the time the people in it, like Henry G., you would find that he is actually, for our listeners, the editor of the Nature Journal, which is a very reputable science journal.
Exactly.
So if you had Googled it, like if I caught this on TV partway through and I saw Henry G. talking, I'd be like, okay, it's a documentary. Yeah. And it would take me a while before I was like, wait a minute, this is not.
I've got a really great story about that, because I remember when the parts that Henry G. was in, at that time I had never met Henry G. And so all I could remember is some of that footage that they showed, when he was younger and when the discovery had happened. And so I was thinking, well, is it him, or have they just found an actor, right, to sort of look like him and sound like him? And I'm like, but that sounds like his voice. Like when I've heard him speak, that was it. And so I was never quite sure. But then they have Gregory Forth as well, who's now an emeritus professor from University of Alberta, who just by chance has just released a book.
Mm-hmm. It's good timing for this episode.
Good timing, yeah. About his work.
Yeah, we were talking about that in our last episode.
Have you read the book, Matt?
I haven't yet, but I want to.
Me too.
He's done a lot of work on flores, for many decades, and I'm fairly critical of these kind of ideas about there being any connection between whatever folklore and things that people living on flores today might have in Homo floresiensis. But I'm certainly willing to take it into consideration. I mean, we can talk about some of that after. I want to finish this Henry G. story because I wasn't sure, and like, could that be him? But then I can't remember if it was later that year or if it was the following year. But he came to Liangbua to visit. He was on a holiday, and he really wanted to see the site, and it coincided with when we were excavating. And so he came, and he actually spent in the end at least a week, if not, maybe about a week with us. And once he came, like, he looked a lot more like the person that was in the documentary. And so I remember, I think I waited a day or two until, everyone was sort of comfortable. We were all sort of enjoying each other's company. And one day we were driving back from Liangbua, which is kind of a tough ride. It's about an hour, if the road hasn't been paved recently. And we were having a good conversation. And so I was in the back and Henry was in the front seat. And finally I just said, hey, do you remember anything about this sort of fake documentary about Homo floresiensis? And we're really wondering, like, was that you, or do you know, like, and he was trying to think, and he said, I've done so many of these sorts of things, I can't remember, and and I think then maybe I was able to get it on my phone or something like that, and I showed it to him, and he's like, oh no, that's me. Yeah, that's me. And then he remembered. It. He said, yeah, it was a really slick. Like he had no idea. He just thought they wanted stuff about Homo floresiensis. And, he said, thinking back, the only clue now that he could think of that he should have, been onto something, that this was a bit different than the usual sort of documentary, which doesn't usually have much of a budget. And, there's not, like, he went to, they brought him to a really nice hotel. Like, it was everything, they had a lot of money behind it. And they sort of wined and dined him a little bit before the interview. But otherwise, he said it was really, professional. He had no idea. They thought that they wanted information about the discovery of Homo floresiensis. And then so they just cobbled together that footage into, and made it into what it ended up being. But that sort of thing, like you said, Kim, it really adds a weight to it, right? Because when you, even, I guess, I mean, for people that even are scientists themselves, but not involved in the research, I mean, they see that, and then that's something that's going to make it real.
Yeah. I don't know how I'd feel if I thought I was giving an interview about something like that and then found out that it was in a mockumentary like this. Like, I think if he had decided that it would be fun to do,
exactly,
and did it, that's cool. But I don't think I'd feel comfortable having it not be forthright about what their intentions were with it.
Absolutely. And I know, from my own experience, like working at Liang Bua and with Homo floresiensis, it attracts a lot of this. So there's always lots and lots of requests. And I learned a lot from my Indonesian colleagues who have been in it from the beginning. They're very, protective and defensive. Like, just because for us, like if we get contacted by some kind of media or documentary, it's like, oh wow, like yeah, let's do it. Like this is great, public outreach. This is what we're supposed to do. No questions asked. No, we don't charge a fee. We just give up our time to do this. But I learned quickly when I joined the team that, wow, no, like a request comes in, like they dissect it, a lot of discussion internally. Is this really what we want to do? What do they want? They're just going to come in, take up our time, not give us anything and then leave. And then in many cases, never send anything again, like never send even a copy of the footage or even when the program is coming out. Like it's amazing how these things turn out to be this, I don't know what to call it, but it's the same story every time. They're always like, oh no, we're going to send you all of this. We'll make sure and when it's coming out, and we'll send you all the footage so you can use it in your, for your own outreach, but then in the end, that rarely ever happens. It's like you never hear from them again because they're already moved on to the next project, right? Mm-hmm. Which is filming something else. And so it's a very different attitude. And I learned a lot from that. And so now especially after seeing this, like as well, like if I get asked for anything, I usually end up asking a lot of questions first to find out like, okay, what is the real, what's the end product? Where are you going with this? Because you can see that there's not a need, but there's a desire by many people to make stuff like this. Yeah. Anyway, that I remember we ended up having a good laugh, and we watched a lot of it again with Henry, and that might have been by that time maybe I was starting to mellow on it a little bit, but yeah. Interesting.
When I watched the movie, I thought it reminded me of the Australian horror movie Wolf Creek as well. Have you guys seen that one?
I haven't.
Yeah.
No.
Terrifying. It's probably the scariest horror movie I've ever seen. I don't know why. Something just got to me with it.
Really?
Yeah. It's have you seen it?
Yeah.
You have?
Ross doesn't seem like he was
so scared. No, of course not. I just something about it. It just it really got to me.
I think you might just be scared of Australians. Is that what it is, Kim?
It was the especially when he said, okay, we're giving away a movie that we're not even talking about, but it's about a serial killer, and he has this knife, and he puts it into her spine and kind of severs it so that she's like, she can't move, she's paraplegic, but her mind is still there, so he can still torment her. I don't know, it's just something about it which just really messed me up. And yeah, I said I'd never go to Australia. But then, so what it is this story of these three people, tourists, two women and one man, and they go out into the outback, and their car breaks down, and this nice man gives them a ride and says he'll fix the car, and he takes them to their house, and then he turns out to be a serial killer, and it's all crazy, messed up stuff, and then the guy ends up surviving, the women don't, and he goes and tells the story, and nobody believes him, he gets locked up, because they think he killed the women, and that's it. That is based on a true story. Everything that, because most of it he was locked away for, so he didn't get to see everything, so they made up what was happening that he didn't see. But the fact that he was put away for the murders, and then it turned out that there was actually a serial killer was true, and he got released. His name is Paul Onions, and so that he kind of reminded me of that go out into the wilderness with a team, and then people get murdered, and then so he went to jail for quite a while, and it was some Ivan something was the actual serial killer. So then I found out it was a true story, and then that just
yeah, double
but
whammy.
I'm thinking Now that I'm closer, I might go to Australia. And the real guy's in jail, so Ivan's in jail now. I think he might even be dead.
But it's a very convincing hook, though, isn't it? The kind of the way they kind of lure you into the story with the kind of jailing of the ornithologist Darrow for the murder of his friend and his guide. It does kind of instantly kind of invest you in the story. So from a kind of plot line point of view, it's really well done. I can't fault that.
No, well, and then it's the interview. Like, I think if even watching it, recently again, that interview with Timothy Darrow's sister that comes up early, like it's just, it's real. Like, like she seems devastated, lost her brother, this terrible story. It crushed their family. And, at that point, I think, at least in the version that I've seen, you haven't even seen this. There's been no science presented. It's just this story, which, those kind of things are much harder to tell. Like, how would you know necessarily? But given the way they then present it, you'd think, oh, there's got to be something online then about this event. I think one of the things I remember that irked me is the sense that, they soon have an Indonesian official sort of give a thing. And he's Indian. Like, he's not, I mean, if you spend any time in Indonesia, he doesn't have an Indonesian accent. There's nothing about it like that immediately, if you've been to that area, you realize, oh, this is fake, like, why couldn't they, I guess I sort of think of these colonial undertones, right? Like, it's fooling all of, mostly us of a European background or in our various countries in the Northern Hemisphere, just playing on these stereotypes, if you will, right? Or getting away because of the way we think about these things. And then even, I think a lot of the footage of what was supposed to be the villages in Flores is actually in the Philippines. And I remember detecting, like, when they were speaking, it didn't sound quite right. Like, it didn't sound like, to me, what I was expecting. And but what I've learned is apparently they actually had clothing of Nage, or I think from a part of in Central Flores, that they brought, but they then did it in the Philippines. And so there were these these subtle things that were there that I think, I mean, in some ways, thankfully, because it does sort of help expose it as not being real. But it with a little bit more maybe financial backing or desire, they could have even made it even more real. Like, if they had, because they do have other parts that are Indonesian. Like, for instance, when they go to that jail, there's no question. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe they're not, but they look to me like Indonesian police officers, like the way they're dressed, the way they walk, the signage on the walls in Indonesian is all correct. Like, I'm pretty sure they may have filmed that at a real Indonesian jail. It didn't come across as not being real like some of the village scenes did. So anyway, parts of it there do seem real, and definitely, like, Indonesian prison is not where, that line of I forget who it is, a broadcaster or something, a Dutch guy, like, he says, like, that prison, like, they don't send you there, they send you there to die, and that certainly does ring true.
It's interesting. I mean, there are lots of very almost deep cuts of showing that they've put a lot of effort into trying to get that authenticity. Definitely with, like you said, with the jails and with the police that they used, and they sort of slip up a bit when they cast somebody of South Asian descent as the kind of police liaison or whatever. But then there's also a subplot about how the ornithologists are originally there to look for Flores hawk eagles and to see if they can find the Flores scops owl. And again, this is something that is, real, that the Flores scops owl is one of those almost kind of Lazarus taxa that had been thought extinct, or at least incredibly rare, and hadn't been seen for a century. And people have gone back to sort of look for it and have found it. And I think they actually do use the real recording of the Scops owl as at the end of the film when they're talking about how the Darrow expedition Hornbrook puts out a paper saying that they found the Scops owl in 77 with the Darrow expedition. I think they actually do use a real Flores Scops owl call on that. So that's really, that attention to detail is pretty incredible, especially in comparison to some of the films we've watched over the last few weeks, blaming no one except Josh for those. But yeah, it's just nice to have, given how much problems there are with muddling the truth, but that kind of attention to detail and commitment to making something believable is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because there is clearly this intent, and they succeed on many levels. But when they get into the science surrounding the paleoanthropology, for instance, it really breaks down quick, right? But yet at the same time, as an example, like they do that footage of Hornbrook and some other Indonesian colleagues in a cave, and they show this footage. It's actually very similar to the footage of the original BBC, I think, documentary of Homo floresiensis. Like they actually copied, or tried to recreate aspects of that footage, even like the angles they're at and what they're doing. But then the pieces that they have, like you can see right away that there's a skull on the thing. Like it looks completely fake if you know anything about human anatomy. And there's just other details that thankfully, again, if there had been any consultant involved that knew anything, they could have made it even more real. And I think as an example, like a big giveaway is when they show these blades, these weapons.
Yes.
I mean, it looks like some kind of 3D printed prototype. Like it looks fake, and yet like it's got the it's a combination of early stone artifacts from North America. Like it's sort of got combinations of that, and yet that is just a complete giveaway. Like there's nothing like that from Flores, and stone artifacts don't usually look like that, especially not uniformly. And so if they had just stuck with simple cores or old one like flakes, it would have been a lot more believable.
That was one of the bits, that anyone familiar with archaeology would be like, yeah, this isn't for real. But then at the same time, when they're showing these obviously fake and unrealistic flint knives, they do an incredible job of talking about the bones they recovered from the cave site, how they scan them and they find cut marks, and they find sort of flint within the cut marks, which is a fairly good explanation of real techniques that are used in the field. So yeah, I mean that was really, it's a kind of weird mix between really detailed and accurate and just totally kind of off the wall nonsense. It's kind of quite disconcerting.
Yeah, that's a funny part because like I mentioned, how they really did just like what they did is they watched documentaries about Homo floresiensis and tried to recreate aspects of them. And if I'm in this mockumentary, that is where it is, because I was in a documentary about Homo floresiensis in, I think it was 2008, and part of the footage of me in that documentary is me laser scanning the bones, right? And so they basically recreated that from that particular documentary and had the scan, except like the scanner, the way like that is the last way in the world I think you would try to scan the bone, but they at least have, they've got the right angles and images of what is actually going on.
Yeah.
I enjoyed how they said they couldn't get DNA from the mandible because it was too burnt.
That was really good too. I mean, that was my kind of ears sort of went up. Hello, but that was really good. And again, fairly accurate and true to form.
Well, but the mandible wasn't burnt though.
Yeah, I mean, it's for these reasons that I think, or at least I'm considering incorporating it more into my undergraduate teaching. To have students watch it, before maybe presenting them with some of the primary literature about Homo floresiensis, and then having them sort of work on a project themselves to, try to debunk it, or what parts can you now tell and discern, or, because I think as a learning process, it would be very, very beneficial, because many of them at the beginning of a course would have no idea, even those that have probably taken, first and second year archaeology and anthropology courses would have a tough time, factually debunking different parts until they sort of dive in and do a bit of research themselves.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have a question for you, Matt. So my understanding is that the postcranial remains of floresiensis it's well accepted that it was bipedal, so walked on two legs like us. Mm-hmm. It's probably not exactly like us, more like a Australopithecine. And its shoulder joints were more forward-facing. And in the movie, they had them brachiating, like a gibbon. But I don't think that would be how we think they move the trees. Is that correct? That's correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where one of the, inaccuracies of the movie is, right? Like, and even using the term brachiation, right? I mean, that, how that term has been used historically within paleoanthropology has changed a lot, right? At one point, that's how, if we went back 100 years ago, that's how everyone would be describing how apes moved. They all brachiated. But, now we realize that, no, it's really only gibbons and siamungs that truly brachiate. Other apes are essentially slow, cautious, climbers, vertical climbers. They're not going arm over arm at all. I mean, it's the same idea. I talk about it with my kids all the time when we go to the playground, right? Because it's the monkey bars. Well, monkeys don't do that. Monkeys don't, they can't, except, well, spider monkeys can, I guess, they have some convergences in their shoulder morphology that allows them to do stuff like that. But otherwise they don't, right? They have a restricted shoulder joint. And even though, LB1 certainly does, at least from Susan Larson's work, the level of humeral torsion on it suggests that the shoulders would have been more sort of forward in the body. They would have had full, mobility at the shoulder joint like we do, but they wouldn't be rapidly moving through the canopy in that way. Although, that being said, that initial footage when they use the term brachiation, I think like they're really just running on the top of the branch, right? They're not really brachiating. But they just say that, or they do a leap at the end. So it's a subtlety there that I think they just think that's how scientists talk about things moving in the trees. It's called brachiation, and that's incorrect.
And you have to remember these guys are ornithologists as well, so they won't know.
Sure, although it's interesting part of the story that they drop, like, I don't know. I don't think a true ornithologist would like drop their interest in birds just because there's an ape. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like they seem to quickly, oh no, this is way more important. And I bet if we had any ornithologists here, they'd be like, who cares about an ape? Like, where's this bird?
Yes.
That is a very good point.
I don't know. Jared Diamond is an ornithologist, isn't he? He wrote a whole book about humans.
Okay, maybe, yeah. I mean, he has a very deep interest in Homo floresiensis. He's always been really interested in. And in fact, years ago, he actually wrote a paper that was in Nature, I believe, well before Homo floresiensis was discovered, talking about the stegodon, the pygmy elephants known from Flores, and their relationships with Komodo dragons. And so I think when Homo floresiensis was discovered, his interest was quite piqued because he had done work in the near region and knew a lot about the fossil history. Yeah, but Kim, back to your point, like, yeah, postcranially, there's no question that Homo floresiensis was bipedal. It's really the distinctions between modern humans and Homo floresiensis is within the body proportions. So they have more Lucy-like arm and leg proportions, so sort of in between what we see in apes and humans today. And then, of course, unknown at the time of the discovery, but subsequent, we now know they also had really long feet, and it really matches the Hobbit moniker, even though that wasn't known at the time the nickname was given. But so there's no way that they would walk exactly like us, but if we were to see them moving. I think that's part where one of the things that I'd be critical about in this show is that when they do show them moving, I don't know, I think they could have shown them walking bipedally more normally. Mm-hmm. They did sort of overemphasize some sort of almost ape-like movements in a bipedal posture, which I think wouldn't be the case. But with those long feet, it's pretty clear that Homo floresiensis wouldn't have been able to run like us. There would just be no way. If you start increasing speed with that foot proportion relative to the rest of the lower limb, you're going to be pushing the limits of being able to clear the foot and also, handle the loading that would be generated. So I usually tell my students that the best way to think about Homo floresiensis is locomotion, and this is also true for say, afarensis, based off of partial skeletons like Lucy, is that bipedally they would walk pretty much like us at slow speeds. So walking, it would be pretty much indistinguishable. But if they were to run, that's where you would see modern humans would be just much better runners. But on the flip side, if we were going to climb a tree, well, now all of a sudden our long hind limbs and short feet are a disadvantage where now we can't vertically climb because our center of mass is too far away from the vertical substrate. And so we have to go up a tree almost like an indrid, like a shifaka or something. Like we've got to wrap our legs on either side and this, hop up like a frog almost the tree. Whereas Homo floresiensis and other early hominins with these shorter lower limbs would have been able to basically just walk up the tree because their center of mass is close and they can just use their slightly longer arms to help them to move up. So it's sort of an interesting, just subtle difference in the adaptation to the locomotor behaviors.
Interesting.
So at the towards the end, the narrator says that they were capable in the trees and can walk on the ground. So that would be accurate? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly what we think we know based on the locomotor anatomy. So where would you say Homo floresiensis fits into the hominin family tree now? They offer two hypotheses in the movie, neither of which I'd ever heard. They say maybe it was a pongoid ape, a relative of orangutans, or a subspecies of macaque with variant coloration and incidental bipedalism, which sounds kind of ridiculous to me.
Well, but this is exciting, right? Because those are not the main hypotheses about Homo floresiensis, but it's worth thinking about, especially in relationship to the Ibu Gogo stories, because I think there's a connection there. Now, I mean, initially, so let's think about this. So Flores is an oceanic island, right? But for people, including myself, before I got involved in the research on Homo floresiensis, if someone were to say Indonesia to me at that point, I would think, oh yeah, orangutans. And so I think for many people, even scientists that just aren't familiar with the biogeography there, oh, Flora, you found something, it looks hominin. Well, couldn't it be an orangutan or an ape? But this is not having an understanding of the biogeography here. And I'll be honest, the 2007 science paper that I wrote and published on the wrist of Homo floresiensis, during the review process, it was a comment from one of the reviewers about, well, what about orangutans? And so, I mean, I don't know who the reviewer was, and I'm sure they know their stuff, but, not everyone can be an expert on everything, right? Mm-hmm. And, but the reason why it's unlikely is because Flores is east of Wallace's line. And, Wallace's line is arguably one of the most interesting biogeographical boundaries in the world or ever discovered. And even the way it was discovered is to me, so fascinating. Like, here you had Alfred Wallace out there just looking at stuff, just looking at the animals and the plants and traveling, and noticing these changes. And as he moved from island to island and just recognizing this just off the data, like he didn't have no ocean research ocean liner to go out there and measure ocean depths or anything like that. And yet he inferred from what he could observe around him that, it must be so deep just along this narrow channel. It must be so deep here that at times of low sea level, there was still ocean. And that, explains why we don't see orangutans. We see them on Borneo and Sumatra, and we also see them, archaeologically or paleontologically in Java, as well as elsewhere further north in the Southeast Asian continent. But we don't see them on Sulawesi or Flores or Lombok or New Guinea or Australia and so on, because that, even though that passage of ocean is much narrower than, say, the ocean between Borneo and Sumatra, it's just much deeper. And so, the area between Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, even at the last glacial maximum, was just all continent. And so, I think that's such an interesting part of this story that, okay, wait a minute, we've got something that's east of the Wallace Line. It's certainly worth considering. Could this be an ape that maybe did get across? So, how can we tell that it's not an orangutan? Well, like I pointed out I think I pointed out in my response to that reviewer at the time was, interestingly, not only Wallace, but if we go back to Darwin's time, you had Thomas Huxley, who, was a big advocate of Darwin's ideas and actually provided a lot of the raw data that Darwin even used to suggest that we had a closer relationship with African apes than Asian apes. And one of those pieces of evidence is that, we, and like humans and African apes, have 8 wrist bones, whereas orangutans and most other non-human primates have 9. The scaphoid and centrale are not, they're both separate bones in those other primates. And so here with Homo floresiensis, it has a true scaphoid. It has 8 wrist bones. More importantly, obviously, is the upper canine lower P3 honing complex is simply absent in Homo floresiensis. It's a hominin. It would be very difficult to think of convergence in such exact detail to not have a honing upper canine. If it was an ape, it would almost certainly have that those features. But initially, again, when it was first discovered, a lot of these questions were brought up, by reputable scientists. There's certainly the questions to ask, but I think the evidence is pretty clear on that aspect. Now, okay, so if we go to the macaque idea standing up, Flores does have macaques, and so you could think, if you travel to Flores, which I'm sure maybe these people did at some point that made this movie, and they would have arrived in Labuan Bajo on plane, you're going to see macaques running around, and you're not going to go there without at least taking a boat trip to Rincha or Komodo to see Komodo dragons, and you're going to see macaques. They'll steal your, Ross and Josh, if you get off the boat, they're going to come up and steal your glasses if you're not careful. They're there and they're intense. And which brings up a whole other interesting question, because when we excavate at Liang Bua, we find macaques, and we find porcupines, and we find civet cats, and we find deer occasionally, and that's the fauna that if you visit Flores today that you see, at least the small mammalian fauna. But that is only in the very top layers of the cave, and once we get below about 3,000 years ago, those animals aren't there. And going all the way down into the Homo floresiensis layers, they're not there. And the same is true for pigs, except pigs do extend a little bit further back. We do find pigs back till about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago in the sequence. But before that, no. And the modern fauna that we see on Flores in terms of these animals, they didn't get across the Wallace Line on their own. They were brought by people. And they were brought, fairly recently by people, within the past 3,000 to 4,000 years. And this is one of the reasons why I'm quite skeptical about the Ibugogo stories, is because the people that live on Flores today all speak Austronesian languages. And Austronesian languages are part of a big family that extends throughout island Southeast Asia. But essentially, the broad picture is that they originate from Taiwan, and they were very, very skilled mariners, and they also farmed. And they basically dispersed, and expanded. And, obviously not just, replacing people, but very much in a mixture way. Like I think about it a lot of times similar to how the British colonized. Like we all speak English now. Like my genes don't go back to, England. They go back to a variety of places in Europe, but I don't speak any of those other languages. I speak English. There's this cultural mix where we then identify with sort of the dominant cultures, and the Austronesians were kind of like that, I think, or that's the way I sort of envision that. And so, when they reached Flores 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, that's why everyone on Flores now speaks these Austronesian languages. If that hadn't happened, the languages spoken on Flores would be like the hundreds of languages that are spoken on New Guinea, right? They didn't get there. And so it's a completely different language family. And so, Ibu Gogo stories from whatever group on Flores maybe are based in some things on fact, but it's probably, if it's really an old story that's been passed down for generations, then it's not from Flores. It's from somewhere else in island Southeast Asia that's been brought. And you do actually have those kind of stories throughout the region. Often they're called not Ibu Gogo, but Orang Pendek, which there's also a number of documentaries about, these short people living in the forest. Mostly, I think, as skeptical scientists, we do default to the idea that, okay, maybe it's a macaque, right? Or another, common primate that, hey, at times, if, it's at dawn or dusk and you can't see that well, and all of a sudden through, over the trees and in the slight darkness, a primate sort of does something, behaviorally that isn't necessarily unexpected. Like if you saw a macaque walk bipedally at a zoo, right, you're not going to be overly surprised. I mean, they will do it. They can. They just don't do it all the time. They're not doing it habitually. And at certain times or places, your eye could easily be tricked. And so to me, it's not surprising that, people from this part of the world would have stories surrounding those things. There's going to be things that would happen that would be, become, part of the regular folklore, and people would probably see it more than once. Different people would see, oh, no, I saw the same thing, and you can, I can visualize why those stories are there. But I guess when Homo floresiensis was first discovered, and it was thought that maybe they were there up until even 11, 12,000 years ago, you might think that could be true. But again, based on the archaeology at Liangbua, it suggests that no, Austronesians arrived 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. We don't know for sure. I mean, it's an open question whether or not there is any, connection with people that might have been on Flores before that. But we certainly don't know. There's certainly no evidence that suggests that you have continuity as yet. Maybe someday, maybe genetic evidence might be able to shed some light on that.
Or overlap. I mean,
overlap. Yeah.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I would think it's quite distinct. And so it's interesting, these Ibu Gogo stories. It's not just this one group. There are other distinct ethnic and cultural groups on Flores that have similar stories. So
it's very much like a kind of folklore archetype. I mean, you've got everything from Irish leprechauns and Scottish fairies to Welsh gnomes and brownies and redcaps, and people seeing small humans is not rare in the folklore of the world.
Absolutely.
But I'm interested in the macaques on Flores. So are they not distinct from the species you find on geographically, let alone biogeographically nearby islands? Is that there's not any specific distinction between the Flores macaques and ones you find nearby?
No. Well, I hope I'm not going to misspeak, because I wrote I was part of a paper that was published a couple years ago with Ben Evans, who's at McMaster, and he's a specialist in the genetics of macaques. And this is what we were doing. We actually tried to look at the DNA from the macaques on Flores to compare more broadly and investigate this potential dispersal scenario. Well, the macaques that are on Flores are Macaca fascicularis, which is the regular long-tail macaque, like, least concern in terms of conservation status. They're throughout island Southeast Asia. Like they've basically been very successful getting to a lot of these places. And there's been some suggestion that there might be some slight, some colorage, some pelage differences in the populations, but nothing that strong enough to suggest it's a different species. And genetically, they're very similar. And so we were really interested in trying to look at macaques that are on the island today, as well as these ones that we find within the recent archaeological sequence with ancient DNA. Hey, can we time it? Can we actually see that they are actually dispersed here within the last 3,000 to 4,000 years? And unfortunately, it's not super clear cut. I mean, we were only looking at mitochondrial DNA, which has its limitations because it's only maternally inherited. But it basically still, we weren't able to fully discern whether or not could macaques have actually gotten to Flores a bit earlier, or at least across the Wallace line a bit earlier than that, earlier than when the Austronesians did. But it can also support the idea that maybe they were just brought there within the last 3,000 to 4,000 years.
Because they are pretty. My understanding is they are pretty good dispersers. I mean, there are various kind of endemic species of macaque in places like Sulawesi and other.
Absolutely, yes, and so that was one, and that's a lot of Ben Evans' research is on the Sulawesi macaques, and so there is this history of a very deep early dispersal, right, that had led to these the other species essentially evolving. But with Macaca fascicularis, it's certainly more recent. It's within the last, at minimum, a few tens of thousands of years. And it still may be tied to human dispersal. Like the Austronesians weren't the first ones there. There were Australo-Papuan or Australo-Melanesian people, the ancestors of modern Papuan and Australian Aboriginal people today that got to these islands. Hey, probably if the archaeological work on Australia is right, that suggests as early as 65,000 years ago. Now, there's a lot of debate over that early age, right? More people are comfortable with about 50,000. And that jives with what we see at Liang Bua. We have, at Liang Bua, we have radiocarbon ages of 47,000 years ago that come from charcoal that we do not find below 50,000 years. So we don't even have charcoal to try to get an older date. Like we get charcoal everywhere at that time. And then we have a change in the raw materials of the stone artifacts that suggest that this is when modern humans first arrive on Flores. And then we also find hearths and other behavioral evidence that we don't see in the Homo floresiensis layers.
So there's charcoal in the floresiensis layers then?
No, there isn't.
No.
Okay. Yeah. So just to back up. Initially it was thought that Homo floresiensis was there until 11 or 12,000 years ago. But in 2016, we published a paper in Nature that through our more extensive excavations, that Homo floresiensis is only found in deposits that are older than 50,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so it's really once we get this charcoal and these other behavioral indicators of our species, that's why we're finding the charcoal. Like it's hard because you never have a second chance to make a first impression, right? And the fact that the original Homo floresiensis papers came out and said these are fire yielding hobbits, right, is hard to shake. Now, and I'm not against the idea that Homo floresiensis, maybe they did use fire, right? Maybe they did, but we don't have any evidence for it yet. The charcoal and the burnt bone that was, used as evidence for Homo floresiensis fire capability was a result of misunderstanding the stratigraphy. And so you have these older deposits here that include Homo floresiensis, and you have these younger deposits that have overridden them that include modern human behavior and all of these burnt bones and charcoal and so forth.
Classic cave stratigraphy being more complex than anyone ever thinks.
Sort of. It actually isn't. It's not your typical cave like stratigraphy like you'd find in South Africa or elsewhere that can be really complex. But it just has this. I always sort of describe it like we can see it as we move through a large part of the cave. You basically have an older erosional surface that's like a hill. So you can easily imagine a hill that has all this old stuff in it. And then just imagine that hill got covered by a lot of sediment over tens of thousands of years. All of a sudden, the hill has disappeared and you have a flat surface up top. If you excavate, you start clipping that older hill. And so you've just got, things are just juxtaposed like on a 45-degree angle, sort of. But yeah, so, we see that modern humans were likely on Flores at least 46, 47,000 years ago. And, were probably related to people that also reached Australia and or New Guinea. Since that time, you've had people in these regions. And so it's possible that those very first human dispersals to this area also brought macaques. I mean, like you go to Flores today and you drive around any of the towns, like you'll see them, they're for sale. Like people have them in cages. Macaques are, humans are naturally interested in primates. And so there's no question that you would have had people try and capture them or use them for food or bring them as pets. Like Kim has her cats there, right? It's the same idea. And so it maybe they were brought across the Wallace Line by earlier human populations, but just not extensively. And then when the Austronesians did it, then it was more extensive because they essentially recreated Flores. Like that's another interesting part of this story is that, they're moving to a new place or they're dispersing, they're expanding, but they bring parts of home with them, right? Mm-hmm. They bring their animals, they bring their plants, they recreate. And so when we often say this when tourists come to Liang Bua while we're there, and they'll talk about what they've seen on the island and we'll say, yeah, well, you realize all those animals are fairly recent. If you had, planned your trip 8,000 years ago, it would have been very different.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I guess that's a common thread throughout all of island Southeast Asia, that the kind of pioneers bring their kind of culture with them. And that's true of, the Polynesians and the Maoris, the Lapita people, everyone takes home with them, which is neat. But going back to your previous idea about overlap between hobbits and modern people, I'm sure, I don't think anything's come out yet, but I'm sure there must be geneticists working on sampling modern, ethnographic sampling of modern Floresian human groups to try and find if there's any signal of an unknown lineage being incorporated into their genomes, because that's something that would be fairly straightforward to do.
Absolutely. It's actually,
and would be really interesting.
It's been done, actually. There was a paper published just about maybe it came out about 6 months ago.
Yeah, I think so.
Or within the last year. And so they did exactly that. So using all the published genomes from Southeast Asia, and including island Southeast Asia, and including many samples from Flores, they searched for what they call super admixture. Because obviously there's admixture, there's archaic or super archaic admixture. So we do know that there's archaic admixture from Neanderthals and Denisovans. And there's also this interesting pattern that groups from east of the Wallace Line, so essentially Papuans or Australopapuans, have 5 to 6% of their DNA is Denisovan, way more than in other places. And this raises the question, and, there's been a lot of suggestion about this, that maybe Denisovans were across Wallace's line, right? Maybe they were in Sulawesi. For instance, there are stone artifacts on Sulawesi that are at least 125,000 years old, maybe older than 200,000. Hey, that could easily be Denisovan. I think, I mean, this is, if I try not to have too many harebrained ideas, but like the 65,000-year-old site on Australia, nobody really talks about this, but, okay, there's archaeological evidence of humans. Does it have to be modern human?
Yeah.
Right?
Why not?
Like genetically and everything, it doesn't look like it's that, like modern humans could be there that long ago. The convergences are more about the 50,000 year thing. What if Denisovans were across? What if maybe they got to Australia? I think this is sort of one of the things. I hope I live long enough to see some of these questions resolved, because I think it could come as a pretty big shock to a lot of people. But actually, we shouldn't think that it's that surprising. It's a possibility, right? Given the pattern that we see so far. And so anyway, they investigated this idea of, okay, what would, if we know what Denisovan genomes look like, we know what Neanderthals look like, we can pull all that out and see that archaic admixture in these groups. What about anything that's super archaic from that? And they did, and the conclusion was they don't see any. They don't see any evidence that you could have something that could be Homo floresiensis, right? Or what we think is Homo floresiensis, unless, of course, another thing that, some people consider, I think it's highly unlikely, but I give it's possible, maybe not plausible, but possible. Maybe Homo floresiensis is Denisovan in some strange way, I think it's unlikely given the anatomy, but who knows? This is until we get DNA from Homo floresiensis, we sort of have to at least keep these various balls in the air. One of them, will drop sometime, and so or
until we get some good skeletal remains of definite Denisovans.
Exactly. Yeah. If it isn't already like Dali, Jinishuan, like all these other ones that we've had all this time, right? That's what I suspect is, they've been looking at us for a long time. We just weren't able to recognize them. Or even that new discovery, what is it? Homo, they named it, but from
the Dragon Man.
The Dragon Man. Come on, if that's not Denisovan, come on.
I know.
So I think these things I think it'll resolve. I think it may not be as complicated and messy as we have been starting to be led to believe. I think there'll be some clear patterns here, because it's just, in the end, it's just biogeography. And to me, it's exciting that hominins are just following exactly what you'd expect from any other mammal. So you've got, modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals and in West Asia and Europe, and then you've got Denisovans. It's just geographic partitioning of genetic and other biological material, over time. And so, in any case, from what they can tell, from all the genomes we have so far, there's no clear evidence of anything that would be consistent with some type of super archaic admixture event with Homo floresiensis. Now, to provide some more context, okay, so Flores, the oldest evidence of modern humans on the island is at Liangbua, right? Like I said, 47,000 years ago. There's, within the sequence, just prior to that is a major volcanic eruption, a pyroclastic flow that would have decimated this region of Flores. And, it's got about roughly a meter of this volcanic material. And we think that, it's right below these carbon dates at 47,000 years. We have some other U-series and luminescence ages that suggest that eruption is 50,000 years ago. Underneath that, and mostly underneath sediments that are 60,000 years old, or what we think is 60,000, is where we find Homo floresiensis, where we find stegodon, where we find giant marabou storks, vultures, and Komodo dragons, right? These are, I sort of call them the big Flores five, right? You've got your Flores five, or you've got your big five in Africa. This is what was on Flores. These are the only animals that we have any evidence for that are greater than 2 or 3 kilograms on Flores at that time, right? Everything else is, we definitely have rats that are that size and smaller, but that's it. Everything else is smaller. And they all of a sudden, you can be digging in those sediments and that's all you find. You find a lot of this, like stegodon especially, and then and a lot of stone artifacts, and you get these bird bones, some Komodo dragons, some hobbit bones mixed in, and then this volcanic eruption. And then everything changes. Now, all of a sudden, there's charcoal everywhere. We no longer find any of these larger elements. And, it's just basically your rats and bats for the next 45,000 years until about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, when all of a sudden it explodes with all of this new fauna. So it's one site.
Yeah.
There's no other, Flores is a fairly big island, right? We don't know. Okay, so what happened? Something happened. We suspect that if Homo floresiensis had survived, then we should find some signal maybe at Liangbua of them after, but we don't seem to. Maybe humans did only arrive after this ecosystem collapsed, right? My suspicion is that, we know that hominins have been on Flores for up to 1 million years, right? There are stone artifacts dated in Central Flores to at least 1 million. Like, they're below the 1 million-year-old date. They don't know for sure how old they are, but they're there. And then you have stone artifacts and sediments all the way up to 700,000 years ago that also include this jaw with teeth, a lower mandible, that is similar in size and shape to LB1. It looks like Homo floresiensis has been on the island for a long time and has stegodon and Komodo dragons. And so to me, I think that you just have this scavenging guild, if you will, that includes the Komodo dragon, the large scavenging birds, like you can see in Africa today, the marabou storks and vultures, following stegodon around. And the hominins are getting in there when they can, after the fact, probably, smashing open the bone, getting at the marrow that's left. And something clearly happens to stegodon. And if that happens, maybe everything else collapses. The only survivor of that group is Komodo dragons. And to me, I think it's possible that they did survive. But if we look at their distribution today, they're not found in inland Flores, right? They're only found along the northern coast and then on the satellite islands, like Komodo and Rincha and a few others. Well, the northern coast, what's happening? Well, all the ocean currents are flowing and hitting the coast. They bring all of these dead marine mammals and other fish. And almost certainly Komodo dragons surviving by eating these decaying, corpses, because they're able to eat very rotten flesh, right? And so I suspect that's the only reason why Komodo dragons survived. And I think, I could be wrong, this is just my guesses, but given their distribution, that makes sense. And then you have modern humans come in, and obviously modern humans would have also been probably pushing Komodos away as well, right? But if they had been around Liangbua, I'm sure we would find Komodo dragon skeleton, evidence in the cave from modern human behavior in some way. And yet we don't really. So I think it's interesting in this larger context that, it's certainly possible that maybe something happened due to changes in the paleoclimate, that for some reason the stegodon population collapsed. But of course, we have to think of, well, what if modern humans arrived on the island somewhere, and now all of a sudden you actually have a potential predator of a hominin predator of stegodon that may not have been behaving like Homo floresiensis might have been. Because, I think it's an important distinction. Initially, the original discovery did suggest that Homo floresiensis was butchering and hunting these stegodon, but we don't actually have evidence of that. And the distribution of skeletal elements of stegodon that are found in the cave, if they were hunting them, then they were wasting an incredible amount of energy carrying back parts of the anatomy that they would have been better just to eat wherever they killed the animal. So for instance, like we got lots of cranial dental remains. If a human or Neanderthal group killed an elephant, that's not what they would be dragging back to the cave, right? You would see all the high yield elements that are brought back, and they're going to eat the brain right on the site, the tongue, that kind of thing. They're not going to carry that weight. So, it looks more like Homo floresiensis is a scavenger. But if modern humans show up, they could probably do quite a bit of damage in a very short amount of time to the stegodon population. And maybe they didn't even stay. Maybe they only stayed a season or two and then moved to the next island. But they could have set in motion a cascade that then all of these other taxa essentially collapse and go extinct just prior to the second or third wave of modern humans kind of arriving, exploring, and starting to take root on the island.
Yeah, that's interesting. We definitely have seen humans can have that substantial impact on island environments in more recent years than that. So I think that's a pretty strong hypothesis.
I mean, it's interesting because otherwise, I mean, the giant marabou stork and the vulture, I mean, these are, classic proboscidean scavengers, and the fact that we have them there at Liangbua with, with the hominins and Komodo dragons, to me, is just fascinating. And so right now we have Grace Veach is doing a postdoc at the Smithsonian, and she's looking very intently at all of the stegodon remains with some of our Indonesian colleagues to try to assess about, what is actually going on taphonomically here. So I think the results of that work will be really important in improving our understanding of this aspect of Homo floresiensis behavior.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So once again, we get towards the end of our episode, and our conclusion is that modern humans are the worst. This is pretty much how we end every episode.
I mean, there's a possibility that they arrived right after it all. So, stay optimistic, Josh.
I'll stay optimistic. So we can conclude the cannibal in the jungle probably wasn't Homo floresiensis.
Oh, there's one thing I wanted to bring up with it, though, is why was it called a cannibal when, at what point would something become cannibal? How closely related to us would it have to be before it was cannibalism?
That's a good point.
Like the Family Guy bit where the seagulls are eating chicken bones and the other one tells him it's birds and he gets all freaked out, and I'm like, well, that's like a human eating a cow. What's the difference?
Yeah, it's a good point.
It was not a great title, I think.
Well, but I think the cannibal part, though, is the human, right? The Timothy Darrow, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the cannibal in the jungle
right,
was what they called him. And it turned out not to be the cannibalism. In any case, for anybody listening, it's worth a watch. Watch it. It's I think
it's definitely worth a watch.
I feel like Barack Obama evolving on certain positions. I don't know. I really was. I really was against this before I was for it. But I definitely recommend giving it a watch.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was I didn't have any expectations going in, but I was pleasantly surprised by how good it was.
Yeah, I mentioned this to Josh before. I did find just last night, as I was trying to search around, trying to find out if there were any early versions that they actually had tried to say that the scientist was Mike Morwood. And I actually came across the director has the site, and you can watch the director's cut.
All right.
And so I'm going to give that a watch, because usually those can be quite different than how a channel might package the footage into a slightly different story.
Well, if it's different enough, we could do a whole nother episode on it.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be that different enough, but I suspect it'll be worth the watch as well.
If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestoneage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.